quickly walk through some slides, and then we can also engage in discussion, and you can ask me some questions, and I can help you find resources, and we can discuss what is really dear and near to your heart and talk about that a little more. So just a quick intro about me. Oops. I'm Roland Dubois. I'm currently a product UX lead at Virtual Facility, a data visualization company that deals with facility management. Also, I'm XR accessibility lead for Virtual Leap, a brain training application for virtual reality. A Mozilla Tech speaker, so I talk a lot about the web and the power of the web, especially of the immersive web. Which I'm also a member of the W3C Immersive Web Community Group that oversees the WebXR specification, the API. I'm also now a member of the XR Access Initiative. Then I'm hosting meetups like the WebXR meetup in New York City, where some of you guys signed up for this presentation. My meetup, the WebXR. I'm usually partnering with other meetups to talk topic specific and VR. And also have the A-Frame meetup group, the A-Frame New York City meetup group. That's the East Coast hub for workshops that work with immersive web experiences using the framework of A-Frame to build HTML-like websites that are then progressively enhanced from desktop to VR headset. So if you're interested in really getting your hands dirty, I suggest you join my workshop on the 29th of October, which is just a couple of days before Halloween, and obviously the theme is to create AR props for web AR, and I can show you some of that stuff after my presentation. So so this is a few images of what I'm actually doing. In end of 2016, the Web VR authoring workshop by the W3C was held in Belgium, and I was talking about accessibility at that event, and I also was the conduit for accessibility there. I was playing with the idea of making an inclusive effort for VR and obviously AR, but through the web, and enforcing the standards of the web into this new medium. A few outreach programs in AR for the booth, and some events, and also hackathons that my teams and I have won, especially about the topic of accessibility, which is really exciting. So my agenda today is to talk about the fact, or the question is VR inherently inaccessible based on what we can observe so far in the technology and the devices? Then I'm going to talk about accessibility and the actual laws that surround digital media. And I'm not a lawyer, but it's my duty as a product UX designer to know at least what kind of gray zones they are and what is really important to surface critical edge cases, and also overall broad-reaching universal design standards for user experiences in any kind of digital media, may it be desktop, mobile, phone, IoT, or VR and AR. Then I'm talking about tools and plugins for VR applications that you could put in your VR applications right now, or to troubleshoot and test what you have right now, and make sure that you're thinking more inclusively towards the audiences that you might not know that you actually have. Then I'm talking about accessible experiments, and some of them that I've seen out there, and some of them that I've built myself over the last years. And then I'll give you a punch list, the take action list of things that you can actually do right now, in order to kind of open these open your mind and open the floodgates of inputs that you need in order to actually make educated decisions towards accessible and more inclusive designs for VR. Sounds like a plan? All right. Okay. So looking at device technology over the last years, obviously we see here this the technology, the hardware, and the interfaces we've dealt with when coming from the human-machine interface design with the desktop computers a few years back, 20, 30 years back. You have a machine, you have a peripheral, a monitor, you have an input device you plug in. There's a lot of modularity to it, so there's a lot of layers between the human and actual machines, and we see more and more of a trend going from the desktop to the laptop, merging all the different pieces into one hardware machine. into like turning it into more of a smart screen device where you actually touch what you see, and like removing the friction between the human and the device or the experience, the medium, and then merging it into a nothingness. And if you think about Alexa and the Internet of Things world, you don't have interface anymore, you directly speak to that device, AI and all this other stuff. And the entire trend for technology goes more and more into like removing peripherals, removing pieces that you can plug in and rig and make yours, and more shape that into an intuitive or more natural interaction between the human and the machine. And obviously we also saw Neuralink and Elon Musk and the cyborg ideas and all this kind of stuff, so you don't actually have to do anything anymore, it just works for you. Now I heard like all you guys telling me all about your best VR experiences, and obviously, yeah, Beat Saber is on top of the list, one of the best games out there, the most frequent. It's a game. Yeah, the medium VR is primarily gaming, so that when we think about VR, we think about this kind of scene, right? When we actually interact with VR, this is what we're going to see, right? A lot of controllers, 6-DoF controllers, ideally. You have full range of motion, you have this room and space, and you can do whatever you want, and you can chase things and shoot things. Now, we all see where the technology is going. And actually, I mean, years back, right, this is the Magic Leap is 4 years old now. No, the Leap Motion is 4 years old, Magic Leap is 3 years old in development, and all these different devices are just directly detaching from this hardware, recognizing hand gestures, just making that connection between like natural movement, what you do with your hands, and how does it interface with the device or the medium. And we already saw the HoloLens has hand tracking, the Magic Leap has hand tracking, the HTC Vive has a plugin for hand tracking that I actually saw in January this year at the last MIT Hackathon. And also now OC 6, they just announced hand tracking towards for the Oculus Quest. Now, they announced that in 2017. This is a message. This is an image of 2017. It's a touch screen, by the way. That's why it made this sound. Anyway, so they actually had this agenda for a long time. There's no surprises. However, now we're removing these kind of devices that make it possible for people that don't have 2 hands, 10 fingers, free range of motion, and all this mobility to actually do the same things and same tasks as a person that has that. So we are simplifying, organizing our concepts of interaction between the medium and the human, and then go with that one-size-fits-all approach, right? So that's the question, right? Is it then inherently inaccessible because we do not allow anyone that has any kind of sense of disabilities, free range of motion, arms, that my limb is broken or missing, am I going to be only experiencing half of the experience? How many apps of, like, do you think Beat Saber is able to be played with one hand? No. Right? So, just putting it out there, right? It's not in consideration, it's a game. Now, but we're here at the VR and Education meetup, right? So what do we know about education, right? It's first of all, it's not entertainment. It should be entertaining, but it should be educational. But it also obeys to certain kind of laws, right? So let's define accessibility first, right? So accessibility is this cloudy term that everyone says. I was like, oh, we make it inclusive and accessible. Now, there is actually, by the W3C, this kind of 4 tick boxes, check off kind of phrase that says, when something is accessible, a person with a disability can, to the greatest extent possible, and that is obviously in the eye of the beholder and also in the engagement of the company that wants to enforce that kind of standard, wants to make it acquire the same information. Okay, I don't obscure things, I don't hide things, I give the person the same information whether the person can see or not, hear or not. Engage the same interactions. It's like, I want to press that button, do I need to be able to press that button with my finger, or can I press it differently, right? If I don't have that finger, right? enjoy the same services as the person without disability? Well, that's more like an overall reaching kind of product solution, right? Is your product serving a certain service? Does it do something, and can I do that across the board, right? Do I like, that's more like the strategic aspect of it. And then is it substantially equally easy to use, right? In other words, accessibility is designing things to provide equal access to people with disabilities. Statistics, right? It's always a nice thing. Like, so if you count to 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, we have about 15 people in this room that potentially have some kind of disability, and we can't see it, right? Because it's not always visible. But that's the number, right? We have like 26% of the population in the United States alone that have some kind of sort of disability. There's 1 billion people in the world. These are all customers and definitely people that want to learn, aka education again, right? It's 61 million adults in the United States that currently live with any kind, with some sort of disability. You know? I'm coming from a web background, so my UX design is very heavily influenced from standard compliant W3C standards and web-based interfaces, which are device independent, and the content is king. So Tim Berners-Lee, pretty well-known person, he created the World Wide Web, and he says the power of the web is its universality. Access by everyone, regardless of their ability, is an essential aspect. Now, the web achieves that by not being opinionated about the medium it's running on, right? When you have the web as the baseline, the content that you consume on the web has different kind of alternatives to be consumed via media. So if I have a computer, a tablet, or any kind of device that has a screen, the content can be shown to me. If I have a screen reader, the content can be read to me. Images have alt tags. There's a responsibility to the person that creates content for the web to give alternate paths to consume content, right? So I would argue that that is actually easier than giving someone an experience, which is more inherently what VR is supposed to do. VR is supposed to do immersion and give you the sense of presence and an experience. And that is definitely a level up from just pure content consumption. The fallback of having an app turn into a book, you know, it's not the same thing, right? It's a different kind of medium. And if we create educational applications that solve certain problems that we cannot solve with any other medium, then again, going back to what accessibility means, we should make that experience at the same kind of level enjoyable to someone that has some kind of disability, right? So what kind of disabilities do we have? Again, most of you guys probably know most of them. I just get very good to then run off through it. So we have physical disabilities, people in wheelchairs, people with broken arms. Disability is not it's a fluid state. It's always something that either comes or goes or grows or becomes a fact. I cannot go on a children's ground and swing on a swing for too long because my vestibular system has just punished me over the last years and now it's gone. So I can't do that. The same with roller coasters. Age degradation of certain systems of your body are just inherently part of growing older, and therefore everyone is experiencing some kind of restriction in the same in the range of senses that he has from birth, right? So same the tolerance to sugar, but that's a different sense. Anyway, so auditory, right? If I hear too loud music during my youth, I can lose hearing in one ear. Therefore, stereo audio experiences don't have the same thing. If I make an experience that's purely spatial audio, where sound comes from the right to warn me and I don't have hearing on that side, what am I going to do, right? I don't know. Same with real life, right? Visual disabilities, and that's not only people that have no vision. That's people with low vision, people with colored disabilities, to certain kind of restrictions, cloudiness, distortions of the lenses, that I was just seeing with one eye. Does stereo work for people that only see mono? If you have depth information, some of that might get lost. I mean, your brain compensates a lot, but there's only so much you can do. And in order to create that same kind of inclusive experience, you have to think about, does it make sense to stack things up too deep? Do you show alternatives? Do you increase some kind of contrast? Do you make the layers more prominent to not make it just purely spatial but also more visual? There's a few things that you can do. And then there's psychological, clearly. In my company, virtual facility, our clients are union workers in their mid-40s. A lot of them are veterans. A lot of them have some kind of PTSD or some kind of other psychological things that prohibit them from consuming certain kinds of data too much and overwhelming. Data overload, cognition overload, all this kind of stuff that is really important. Like a VR medium is not purely meant for reading books for a reason, right? First the resolution, first the kind of color and the frequency of the device, and it's really exhausting. So if you have text to read, make sure it has enough contrast, it's big enough, it's not too much text, it's not transparent background, which we see so many times, so often. It just doesn't work from a purely design perspective and also from a consumer perspective. And yeah, so we have that cognitive, how much can I digest? Do I know what kind of interaction is needed? Do I forget that in a week because it's so complex that I have a huge learning curve all the time? And that's not only a brain thing, it's actually also something that is for people that learn the language, right? The language barrier is a disability, if you think about it, because you need to understand first to translate it and then put it in context. So it's a broad scape out there, and we have to think about it in a more inclusive way. So, like I said, 16 people maybe in this room, maybe less, maybe more, who knows, right? The point is, it can't be seen, and it's actually anyone's choice to disclose certain kind of things, right? The fact that I can't go on roller coasters that much anymore, it's sad for me, but it's actually a fact that I disclosed. But the idea is that when it's not our responsibility as designers or creators to intrinsically find what is wrong with you, but more think about the idea that how can I make this work for you and all the other people? Making things inclusive and accessible do not take away from your application. It makes it even more interesting and better because it is the aspect of the universal design. An example down there is, who has been to Pompeii? Yeah, we've seen the photos. The thing is, this is certainly not an accessible boardwalk, but we have nowadays these ramps and these knobs so blind people can see and feel with their feet when they're on the edge of the street. But it's not only for people with wheelchairs or blind people, it's also for people with wheels, children carriers, bicycles. It's just a thing that's smart, and why it's not been done is because people were throwing trash in the streets, and now we don't have that anymore, right? To point one company out that has been doing has been doing so much in that space is Microsoft. And I'm not promoting Microsoft, I'm just saying that from a company that creates most of the applications, and Xbox is gaming, but most of the applications for Microsoft are productivity applications, right? So if you have productivity as a target, you need to think about a broader audience and also about certain different kind of laws. They just came out with they came out earlier this year with this accessible controller that you can basically rig to make it yours. The idea is that the input doesn't have to be an Xbox gamepad, it could be that thing, and just plug it in and it works. Now that is much more accessible for people that have reduced motion, suffer of some kind of jitters or Parkinson, call it whatever there is, right? It's in order to press certain buttons, you need to have a more customized interface. And that's when I talked to you about in the beginning, removing those kind of additional things you can plug into a device is not really helping people that need those customized devices to interact with media, right? Media. All right. There was a case, and who has heard about the Domino's versus Robles case? Arms up. I want to see. Well, it's worth talking about it then. Well, because it actually is a landmark case. Domino's Pizza has an application on the website, and Guillermo Robles was trying to buy a customized pizza on their website and or their app. And the fact is that he is legally blind, so he wasn't able to customize his pizza, and then he was complaining to Domino's about and eventually sued them. And Domino's spent $1 million fighting a blind person in court because they did not adhere to the web standards guidelines of the ADA, right? Because they were building their software inclusive. They spent $1 million and had quite some, I mean, they lost the case, and therefore now it's precedent. Not only lost it a case for the website, they lost it also for their iPhone app. And this means just because they're web standards, they are actually going to be used as benchmark to test against other media that have the same kind of service and or content. And there rings a bell, right? If we create software and deploy it on a device, may it be the web, and a lot of software is going web anyways, right? Think about Slack, think about Google Docs, Dropbox Paper, all of those productivity apps or like websites. Amazon has their own like website and app ecosystem that kind of work in parallel. It's because it's connectivity and collaboration, and because you're in that medium, you have to adhere to higher standards, and these are the guidelines for the VCAG 2.0. I'm not going to talk about all this law stuff later, but the point is that it transcended, it actually went towards the application, which is a different kind of device. It has a different kind of software stack, different kind of ecosystem, but it's still applied to that. So the guidelines for the web are now the standard for other devices, the mobile phones, and it's only a matter of time when that will be transcending into other devices, let's say TVs, let's say IoT or VR headsets. If you have content that can be consumed on one medium and on other media, and it is accessible on one, it has to be also be certainly accessible on a second device and a different kind of medium, right? And it's not a question of the hardware, it's a question of how you architect your experience. Yeah, let's talk about the law. Like I said, I'm not a lawyer, but I had to deal with that kind of knowledge a little while. So I want to share what I know, and I encourage you all to dive deeper into it because it's things that change. You know, there's always amendments, always new things popping up here and there. So let's start with the abbreviations, right? So there's Section 504, Section 508, ADA, and VCAG. Who has seen any of those abbreviations? Please lift their hand. 1, 2, 3. Good. So I have something to teach you. Anyway, Rehabilitation Act of 1973 contains those two sections. It was the first major legislation to provide protection for people with disabilities, and it ties, and this is important, it ties the federal funding to compliance, right? What do we know about educational institutions? They get money from the state, right? A lot of them. Therefore, what they have as products and facilities, like they have to be wheelchair accessible, they have to have elevators. The same thing happens to software and content that you want to build or sell through that facility, right? Section 504 is, like I said, mostly around the idea of the spatial environment of the educational facility or the institution or anything, any entity that like takes money from the federal government has to apply towards the section, towards that legislation. In fact, that's more like about the actual interaction of the human with that space or that medium. And then we have 508, which is much more like focused and honed on top of software and digital media, which is what's getting interesting now. Because the electronics and information technology must be accessible since the computers became famous, right? 1986, and then 1989, 98, and 2017 it has been updated because always newer devices come out, touch devices, and wondering at what degree can you make an Alexa accessible if you are not able to speak, right? Does that make sense? So it applies to agencies and also impacts any company that is remotely connected with those entities. But if you are a contractor that builds software for an educational facility or to an educational company, you are actually inherently supposed to abide by those laws. That's important to know. And then those rules get updated all the time. And in reference, again, it's reference to VCAC 2.0 level AA, the web standards description of accessibility guidelines. So the web is the high bar and everyone tries to adhere to that kind of level of compliance. There's the Americans with Disabilities Act, the ADA, that was passed in 1990 and then amended in 2008. And it prohibits the discrimination based on disability in all areas of public life, and also requires the equal opportunity to participate in programs and services and activities. Hence, ADA compliance letters are coming to companies that create services. May it be food services, and I'm talking about online websites, right? An eBay, a Wayfair, any kind of service online that's providing content to the public has to abide by accessibility laws, right? Yeah. So VCAG, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, internationally recognized. So we have some kind of standard there. Obviously, it's always in the eye of the beholder to a certain degree. It's not super enforceable to a certain degree. If you make attempts to do something, it's much better than just completely ignoring it. Like I said, it's the benchmark borrowed from what the web has provided in the last years, and it applies to any kind of applications across all media at some point. Not VR yet, because VR is still an experimental platform. AR, same thing, but it's not. Since it disappeared from the hype curve, the Gartner's hype curve, it became a standard now. Like VR and AR are not anymore in the hype curve, which means they're actually established media to be consumed by people. And but it is the medical industry understanding AR concept, whether it's sports industries with AR headsets to understand better curves of golfing or swimming or whatever. All these kind of devices are now standardized to a certain degree, have their niche, have their market, and therefore they pick up in interest, and therefore the content that you provide for those devices has to consider those kind of laws. Yeah, not only the VCAG also gives us some kind of like guideline. So when we read all that stuff, it's like, oh, that makes sense. I can use that in my application. Oh, I understand. How do I do this? Now I can do this way, and then I achieve the same goal. So it's kind of like a guideline hand-holding thing. They're not trying to punish you for being creative and building software. They're just saying, hey, think outside of the box. Maybe you can do something that makes that better, or give an alternative in the settings that makes it then accessible for people that have that and that kind of restriction. Like I said before, developing semantically structured applications solve more than 50% of most common accessibility issues. Like I said, if you are hiring engineers that understand how to create sound software and sound code, it shouldn't be a big problem, because when your software is structured in a way that it's supposed to be, it interacts with the hardware in the way it's supposed to be, and the hardware built-in accessibility features can then tie into your software. But if you don't give your software those kind of hooks, all the features that the iPhone has that make the iPhone accessible now would be like for nothing, right? Therefore, like, it's really important to know what you're doing when you develop your stuff. And I'm not talking about startups that are on like on rush deliveries, and like there's a time when you have to like reassess what you're building and just build it correctly, which will help you make that kind of leap much faster. Yeah, and then there's the thing about law stuff. It's getting enforced, right? It's not like that. It's like a suggestion. And we're not in Great Britain. In Great Britain, it's much different. You know, like it's much more strict than the United States. But it doesn't mean that the United States is not going towards that kind of level of enthusiasm, right? So there's the Office of Civil Rights and the Department of Justice. If you have an institution that gets audited, software audits are also very common. Certain kind of laws going to be applying for software if they're being audited. And then you have private lawsuits like the Domino's case, and internal institutional oversight, you know, like compliance officers within their own company. And I've seen it before, consequence for many companies, especially startups, like I said. It costs a lot of money, right? So the number one answer I'm getting every single time a startup tells me, oh, I got an ADA compliance letter from someone that complains that my website or my app is not compliant for the, like, is not accessible. Yeah, great, so let's solve it, right? Another thing about educational applications, right? I'm not trying to like wave the flag, oh my god, and so the educational applications are inherently like under another set of laws because of the federal government paying for some of that stuff, right? So this is really important. It may or may not be possible to sell your application if it's not accessible, right? And that's like a make or break case. Yeah, and it's just barriers, right? You want to make sure as many people get to enjoy your applications as possible, and therefore just thinking outside of the box and be a little bit more inclusive is going a long way. Especially being a pioneer in it is making you stand out against a big competition in VR apps right now. So accessibility tools and plugins for VR apps. Now that I've preached to you about all this kind of stuff, I'd like to show you some tools that you can use for your VR apps. Can you lift your hand who in the room is currently working on a VR application? 2, 3, 4. Okay, so good news. This is not a new problem. It has been a problem since years. Like I said, I've talked about this stuff since 2016. Microsoft has played with that idea since 2012. Like, accessibility is a real thing for VR, and there are online plugins like this plugin Colorblinder, which is a Unity plugin. It's open source. It's on GitHub, and it basically simulates different states of color blindness in your application. So you can see a no color vision deficiency and different kind of deficiencies, and you can see if you are having a point of interest or an area that needs attention in your game or in your experience, you can see, okay, does that still make sense for people that have that kind of color vision deficiency, right? And therefore you can double check yourself. I mean, that's like because VR is a very visual medium, that's like the lowest hanging fruit that you could do. And contrast and color is like, you don't need special gear to do that. You make a screenshot, run it through a Photoshop thing, or use a plugin like that and just see it for yourself. It's like, does that make sense to me or not? So you don't have to be a specialist in order to make those adjustments already. Then there's Seeing VR, and it's a small little video that I'm going to show you. This is actually a tool that's been worked on in collaboration with Microsoft, and Microsoft has, like I said, done a lot in that space. This tool is actually a suite of tools that you can install directly into your Unity application that has a bunch of things in it, from like color contrast to font size to surface like edging to like to make things easier reachable, better touchable. You know, the thing that when you have less precision in your motion, you can just increase the cursor to make that easier touchable. So there's a lot of things you can do with that plugin that makes your app out of the box accessible. And that was like one of the presentations that I saw at the XR Access Summit earlier this year. They were presenting their tool, and I think it's still in beta, but they're going to release I think it's already out. Like, you have to look up, this thing changes every day, but the point is, it's a plugin. So we have your app right now. You can put that in there, connect a few cables, and you have accessibility out of the box. You don't have to be a mastermind in order to build it. Then there's Walk-in VR. That one is actually from 2017, and that's actually a driver-based solution for inaccessibility. Built a Steam VR driver that makes it possible first to simulate locomotion with remote with controllers. That means wheelchair-bound people or seated people or people that are not able to move around. They can simulate their leg motion with their hands, or they can switch between a one arm and two arm motion. So in this example, for this driver application, is that the person is in this case it's the PlayStation VR, but it doesn't really matter. It works for Oculus and all the others. So you actually switch your arm with a button. So if you're a one-armed or broken-armed person, you can move the one arm around, stop it in position, switch to the other arm, move the second arm around. And I'm going to show you real quick how that actually looks, which is quite interesting. Let me see if I can fast forward. So you can see here, he's using, you all have seen that app, right, from the Valve shop. So it's basically, he uses one arm, positions the arm where it's supposed to be, freezes it, and that arm stays in position, and then he moves the other arm, and in the meantime, this arm stays in frozen position. That means if that arm is in the right position to shoot a bow and arrow or point a pistol in certain ways, he literally achieves the same kind of level of ease of use for an application that's meant to be for two hands, but just for one-armed clients, which is pretty impressive, right? So that's one application. And then this is the one which I said where you basically can simulate walking around, just purely like moving your entire body around just by controlling your remotes, which makes spatial is a simulation of spatial interaction in a seated position. Pretty exciting. That's again a driver that's outside of your VR experience. It's again a hardware solution to augment your content into an accessible experience. Maybe like making your experience a one-arm, two-arm nice-to-have experience would be a better solution, because then you wouldn't rely on the Steam driver if you want to deploy to an Oculus store that doesn't have Steam, right? So therefore there needs to be an Oculus driver that does the same thing. So you want to think about a more like inside-out approach than outside-in approach for some solutions, right? Okay. So now that I showed you a few plugins, and there's definitely much more out there. It's a little bit hidden, and it's always a little bit of a hunt what is being maintained, what's not. I wanted to show you that there is stuff out there, and if you look for it and just interact with them, people that have like some ideas, it's not a hard thing to like experiment with. And that's why I'm going to show you some experiments in VR that are more extreme for accessibility. Now, It started in 2000, when was that? 2016. There was a survey from Oculus. Yeah, it was. Facebook is really much into this one size fits all, but also kind of accessibility should go along kind of approach. So the LucasArts lab, the ILMX lab, did a survey on their experience, the trials of Tatooine, and they were presenting that at OC5, OC3, 2016. Which they had this VR experience where you're on this planet, protecting your spaceship from an attack, and they had people in wheelchairs also play. And it turned out that they had to adjust a lot of the interaction in a seated position because you were like hovering behind some kind of things, and you were supposed to open some kind of like door from that spaceship, but being in a wheelchair, you're always in the crouched position because of the height of your headset. Therefore, that person would never see what's attacking him. He wouldn't be able to experience it because it would be default in a crouching position. And he wouldn't be able to reach to open that door of that spaceship because it's out of his reach in a seated position. So they have worked with accessibility testing to kind of offset those kinds of variables and create an inclusive experience for people in wheelchairs for their application, and that's what they presented. Now, wheelchair seated position is definitely one of those kind of like more low-hanging fruit problems, and a solvable problem that you can showcase on a big stage like OC6 or OC4, I think. But yeah, so again, there's other things that are also low-hanging fruits, like captions. BBC has built a VR caption experience, a 360 content, and again, the news, film industry, and all the others that are creating 360 content. It's in like building out, like building in some kind of web inherent, like accessibility tools like closed caption and theater mode, or like peripheral restrictions to not get dizzy and stuff like that. Those kind of things are like really easy to try and test, and also have been done in the past. Here we have an example, like I said, from BBC, and then there's the IMAC test where you have like opera, where you change the color based on who is singing, and you can get it contextualized, and like understand if you're in a 360 bubble and you turn around, it makes sense to tell me what I'm seeing on this view and then I'm seeing on this view. It's not kind of this kind of framed experience that you see in movies, right? That example is again from Microsoft. It's actually a rigged HTC Vive with a cane for the blind that gives you feedback, and so this person is navigating a virtual space just by forced feedback of this physical cane, and navigates a VR space, so like a street or whatever, and gets sound feedback and rumble pack feedback from the device. I'm going to share this presentation so you can watch all the videos because time. But yeah, so this is one of those kind of hardware-intensive kind of experiences. And this one is a really good experience. This is called Seeing AI. It's actually an iPhone app. It doesn't fit very much into the in the VR presentation I'm doing, but what it does is you pointing your device, like with machine learning or AI, towards different areas, and it translates to you if there's a person in front of you that you know or not, if that person's mood is happy or sad, if you see an object, you want to read a letter, there's a letter on the table, it understands and then reads out text to speech. So there's a lot of functionality in this application. It's almost like an AR app, but it's for people without vision, right? And we can think about that functionality working very well in like a VR environment, right? If I'm rotating and I'm like putting my cursor, my handle towards a direction, why doesn't that like raycaster touch that area and not give me feedback of what I'm actually looking at or pointing at, right? those things are like inherently part of the software. The intersection of a raycaster of your remote with the object that you're touching, you know, yeah. This is an example I've built in 2016 that was actually I simulated a little piazza in Italy where I built, this is a web-based experience where I have Anthony here, he goes on the handle Nobility and he works in DC for an accessibility company. I have him navigate this VR space and it has different kinds of interest. There's like a little cafe here and a little marketplace here. It's all spatial audio, and he was like walking around from like these beacons that are like telling him this is north of the piazza and stuff like that. And it was so immersive that at some point he started actually walking, which is pretty impressive for that kind of sensation. So it's actually a VR experience for people that can't see. I took that up a notch, presented a presentation concept at the Department of Transportation in New York City, where I was working on a prototype for the street crossing of 23rd Street and 7th Avenue, which is right on the edge of a house for the blind, visions, it's called. And there's a lot of blind people navigating that street crossing, and just the trouble of like understanding where the APS, these little beeping boxes are on the cross streets, and then understand in the security of their own home, understand contextually where to listen to, where to walk to, how far to go, how many paces, how many steps, without having like being run over by a garbage truck or a bicycle rider or being shouted at by some person that has strong opinions about something. You know, I think it's New York City after all, right? So you can blind all this noise and like really teach them on to listening to spatial audio in a way that gives them kind of a better sense of where to go. The last project that I've worked on earlier this year, which actually won me and my team and me the prize for accessibility at the MIT Hackathon, was the it was a accessible locomotion and interaction controller component for also web VR. It's basically like I was simulating sip and puff interaction for 2D software and brought that into 3D, where we basically have a cursor on an axis, so you can actually point at anything in the room purely with a binary input. All you need to have is an on and off, and you can navigate and interact with any kind of scene in VR out of the box. Therefore, you don't need 6 stuff controllers. All you need is just a button, a click. And it could be a zip-puff input. Zip-puff is more complex, has more layers of interaction. But for me, it was the most like lowest barrier to entry. So I literally could have a quadriplegic person interact and move it through a VR space. Now these are concepts and these are tests, like experiments, and just to like question the status quo of what we know, like gaze control, like looking at something, looking at it, waiting until it clicks. That inherently feels for us like the lowest common denominator, but it's not an accessible kind of lowest common denominator, right? So I was trying to go a little bit further back and look at it in a different lens. So last thing, a couple of minutes, take action. So for you guys, the first thing, I know a few of you have an app in the works. I'd like to give you a little action plan. First, learning about accessibility is not that hard, and evaluating your app is also not as much of a big challenge. We have a lot of documentation, especially from the W3C and the VCAC 2.0 guidelines. And I would say, like, in any kind of software, I would say the approach would be to apply the best practice in new content and then like backfit it afterwards, right? Like what you have right now is good, but when you add something new, think about it more like universally, and then retrofit the rest when you tested the new feature, if that really worked. Because it's a lot of depth that you've created already, and it's not a very sound decision to go and scrap everything from scratch without really having to expose and test. Then the next thing, actually, the first thing that you should do is create an accessibility statement. Like this is like, and I have here a little template for you guys, just that you don't have to start thinking, how do I write that? there's some links here, best practices, and in general for software. What you want to do is say, hey, our software, our device, our product thinks about accessibility. We try to make it work for everyone. Here's an email address to write us if you're having an issue, so we can help you assess that and make a better place. That makes you exponentially less likely to get a love letter from a lawsuit for ADA compliance, all right? So that's like the first barrier of like, well, we already think about it, you know? Yeah, then another thing, consider the fact that when you create content, build it progressively enhanced. I know it's easy to say, it's hard to do, especially if you build stuff in Unreal Engine and Unity. The web is built to be progressively enhanced, right? So you have to have this kind of like build up from like 2D to 3D to VR. Having tandem apps or like additional apps that have the same kind of content but just are easier for accessible, for the need of accessibility. It could work in parallel and therefore like bypass the need to like make the entire VR application super accessible, right? So maybe you have an alternative that gives the same kind of immersion, you know, the same kind of feel. Yeah, look into human-machine interface design and ergonomics, right? The fact that we don't have touch screens on Apple computers is because there's such a thing like gorilla hand, right? You lift your arm up the whole day, it starts falling asleep. It's a really bad interaction. I mean, Microsoft didn't care with their tablet, you know, but they also have it flat down. It's more like an iPad. So in VR, like spatial interaction is inherently something you want to do with your arms because the entire industry goes towards like hand tracking, right? So think about, does it make sense to put your inputs up here, right? Or is it better here? Like there's certain zones that are more comfortable for long-term use, right? So ergonomics is really important, and this thing is not new. Ergonomics has been around since the 40s. And then also think about how assistive technologies right now are solving software solving software problems. Like there's a lot of videos out there for technologies like ZipPuff and or like mind control, like sensors that control with your brain. There is stuff out there that gives you an output. How do you bring that output to enhance your application? And how do they have plugins and software add-ons to make this kind of ecosystem like translate for people with disabilities? So what are the mechanics of that and how can you implement that in your application? It's not that much of a lift, right? Video captions is an accessibility tool that's been standardized, but it is actually an accessibility tool for people that can't hear. Yeah. So assistive technologies, you see here on the side, that person actually is a double amputee. He doesn't have any arms, but he controls both of his robot and arms with his brain. Now, you can either track his robot hands, which is, you know, why, or you can just directly have his brain output plug into your VR experience and have your IK model of your arms react towards what he's thinking about. So you don't have the lag of the hardware that he's already serving with his output. You can directly plug into that kind of output that comes from his brain and directly implement in your VR experience. Again, experimental in this case, but think outside of the box, right? You don't have to like go above and beyond. Yeah, last thing, engage and interact. It's very hard to think empathetically towards huge edge cases unless you know people. I mean, we all have 1 out of 4 chance to know someone, right? But yeah, there's meetups, like the Accessibility New York City meetup group, which hosts always beautiful meetups, and they record everything live. I know the host of it, and he's worked on me on the Department of Transportation demo with me. Yeah, so there's a good chance to get in touch with people and people willing to test the applications and interact and just talk. Then there's obviously Kunitech Meetup has a strong focus on engineering and accessibility. There's an event called Accessibility Build-a-thon, which is from Mariella Paulino. She herself has a hearing aid and also very engaged in like bringing engineers that are themselves like restricted in certain ways to collaborate with other engineers. So there's a good chance for you to build empathy and connect with edge cases to build universal software. Yeah, and then there's some links and some talks. Thanks.